In the autumn of 79 AD, in a wine cellar beneath a villa outside Pompeii, 18 people huddled together as the sky turned black at midday. They had run there because it was cool, because it was familiar, because somewhere in their minds a wine cellar meant safety. It did not save them. Within hours, the ash and the heat would seal that room like a tomb. And centuries later, archaeologists would find their shapes preserved in hardened pumice, curled around amphorae that once held the very drink they had spent their lives producing. The wine that made that region rich was the same wine that could not save a single one of them from the mountain that fed its vineyards. But the story of wine does not start in Pompeii, and it does not start with Rome at all. It starts more than 8,000 years earlier, in the hills of what is now the country of Georgia, in the Caucasus, where people were burying clay jars in the ground and filling them with crushed grapes, long before anyone had a word for civilization. It starts in ancient Iran, where residue on broken pottery shards, dated to roughly 5,400 BC, shows tartaric acid crystals, the fingerprint of fermented grape juice, sitting in a jar that predates the pyramids by 3,000 years. Wine is older than writing. Wine is older than the wheel in some parts of the world. Before humans could record a single thought, they were already getting drunk on purpose. You have to understand something uncomfortable here. Wine was not invented. It was discovered, probably by accident, when grapes left too long in a container began to bubble and turn, and someone, hungry or bored or simply reckless, decided to drink the strange liquid rather than throw it away. What they found was not just intoxication. They found something that did not rot the way water rotted, something that could be sealed and carried and traded, something that, unlike the disease-ridden rivers of the ancient world, would not kill you a week later with dysentery. In a world without refrigeration or sanitation, a fermented, mildly alcoholic liquid was often safer to drink than the water beside it. That single fact, a small chemical accident of yeast eating sugar, would end up deciding which cultures thrived long enough to build empires at all. And yet, for a long stretch of its early life, wine was not a comfort. It was feared. In parts of the ancient world, the strength of undiluted wine was treated the same way we treat hard narcotics today. Something so potent it needed rules, rituals, and warnings attached to it like a leash. The Greeks, who prided themselves on rational order, considered drinking wine without water mixed in to be something only barbarians did. To drink it neat was, in their eyes, a kind of madness, a loss of the civilized self. There's a story, likely embellished but too good to leave out, of a Spartan king named Cleomenes, who reportedly went mad and died a horrifying death. And Greek writers pinned it directly on the habit of drinking his wine unmixed, in the Scythian style. Proof, they said, of what happened when you let the drink control you, instead of the other way around. The Romans inherited this anxiety and sharpened it into law. For centuries, Roman women were formally forbidden from drinking wine at all. Roman legend held that a husband had the right, some accounts say the duty, to kill a wife caught drinking it, on the theory that a woman who could get drunk could also be unfaithful, and that wine was the first domino toward moral collapse. One story, retold by the historian Valerius Maximus, describes a Roman noblewoman named Egnatia Mytenia, beaten to death by her own husband simply for opening a wine cask, and the Roman Senate reportedly found the killing justified. This is the part that should make you angry. An entire half of Roman society was legally barred from something men drank at breakfast, and the punishment for breaking that rule could be death. So how did a drink this feared, this gendered, this policed, end up the defining beverage of the most powerful empire in the ancient world? The answer is a very particular kind of obsession, and it belongs to a man most people have never heard of, Lucius Licinius Lucullus. A Roman general so wealthy and so devoted to extravagant living that his name eventually became a common noun. A Lucullan feast still means an absurdly opulent meal today. Lucullus didn't just enjoy wine, he treated it as a personal crusade. After his military campaigns in the East, he came home with cherry trees, exotic recipes, and, crucially, a fanatical interest in improving Roman viticulture, importing vines and experimenting with aging techniques that had never been tried in Italy at that scale. He reportedly spent so much of his fortune building pleasure gardens, wine cellars, and banquet halls purely to showcase what wine could become. that his own family tried to have him declared legally insane so they could seize his estate. A grown man, gambling his reputation and his fortune on the idea that fermented grape juice deserved to be treated as high art. It worked. Within a generation, wine went from a suspicious substance, policed by threat of death, to the single most prestigious commodity a Roman aristocrat could own, serve, or brag about. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Because once wine became a symbol of Roman status, it became a currency of Roman power. And where there is currency, there is exploitation. Rome's wine industry exploded across its territories, and it did so on the backs of enslaved labor on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Vast estates called latifundia, some spanning thousands of acres across Sicily, Gaul, and the Italian peninsula, were worked almost entirely by enslaved people, many of them prisoners of Rome's own wars of conquest. Picture a single unnamed man, perhaps captured in a campaign against Carthage or Gaul, chained at the ankle by night in a barracks-like structure called an ergastulum, dragged out each dawn to prune vines under an overseer's whip, knowing that the sweetness in the grape he was tending would never once touch his own lips. Historians estimate that by the height of the Republic, enslaved people made up as much as a third of the population of Italy, and untold numbers of them spent their entire lives inside vineyards that fed the appetites of men who considered them, quite literally, tools that could speak. A cluster of grapes, crushed by a bound man's foot in the dark, decided whether a Roman senator's dinner party made him look powerful or pathetic. That is the scale we are talking about. Not symbolic, literal human bondage poured into a cup and called civilization. The excess did not stop at labor. It curdled Roman public life itself. Emperors used wine as a tool of both seduction and terror. The Emperor Elagabalus, a teenager thrust onto the throne, reportedly staged banquets where guests were smothered under an avalanche of rose petals released from the ceiling, wine flowing so freely that men reportedly drowned in it. Probably an exaggeration born of scandalized Roman historians, but the fact that ancient writers thought the story was believable tells you everything about how deep the association between wine, power, and depravity had become. The historian Tacitus, writing about the empire's slow, moral decay, used wine and its accompanying gluttony almost as a shorthand for Rome losing itself. Men so drunk on luxury, quite literally, that they could no longer see the empire crumbling around them. Sit with that for a moment. An empire that once forbade its own women from touching a wine cup at the threat of death ended its life being described by its own historians as drowning in it. The named villain in this chapter of the story is not one man, but an entire economic machine. And if it needs a face, it wears the face of the Roman wine merchant class known as the negotiatores, who by the late Republic were shipping such staggering volumes of wine into conquered Gaul that Roman writers themselves recorded alarm at the scale of it. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote, in what reads today less like anthropology and more like a corporate strategy memo, that Gallic tribes were so hungry for Italian wine that a single amphora could be traded for an enslaved person. Read that again. 1 jar of wine for 1 human life. Roman traders reportedly moved so much wine into Gaul before Caesar's conquest that some historians argue it functioned as a kind of soft power invasion, softening tribal alliances and destabilizing local economies years before a single legion crossed the border. The blight of addiction was human nature. The scale of the exploitation that fed it was policy, calculated and repeated for profit, jar after jar after jar. The clock at that point was already ticking on the empire that built its whole self-image around this drink. But wine's story does not end when Rome falls. It only changes shape. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed, it was, strangely, the church that kept wine alive through the wreckage. Monasteries across medieval Europe needed wine for the Christian sacrament of communion, and monks, operating some of the only stable, literate, land-owning institutions left standing after Rome's fall, became the accidental custodians of centuries of winemaking knowledge. Cistercian and Benedictine monks meticulously mapped which slopes, which soils, which angles of sunlight produced better grapes, tracking results across generations with a patience no secular vineyard owner could afford. They didn't have the word terroir yet, but they were mapping it, centuries before French vintners turned it into a marketing term. Walled plots in Burgundy that monks tasted, compared, and refined for hundreds of years, laying the literal groundwork for wine regions still famous today. That's a French story, and a specifically monastic one, and it belongs to them. The entire modern concept of a vintage, tracing its lineage to men who were preserving a ritual drink, not chasing a luxury brand. But medieval Europe still had its own establishment panic to work through. And this time, it wasn't about gender. It was about class and purity. As wine spread beyond the aristocracy, city governments across Europe grew obsessed with fraud. Because wine, unlike grain, was disturbingly easy to fake. Merchants were caught watering down wine, adding lead compounds to sweeten sour batches. Lead acetate, sometimes called sugar of lead, was used for centuries by winemakers who had no idea or didn't care that they were slowly poisoning their customers with the very additive meant to make the drink more pleasant. In parts of Germany, wine adulteration became such a widespread public health crisis that some cities passed laws in the 1400s making it a capital offense to sell doctored wine. In Frankfurt, magistrates reportedly ordered corrupt merchants to drink their own tampered product until it killed them, a punishment as theatrical as it was brutal. The fear here wasn't superstition about the drink itself. It was fear of what greedy hands could hide inside it. And that fear was entirely justified because for centuries, lead poisoning from wine additives was quietly killing European drinkers who never once suspected the sweetness in their cup. Out of that same tangled medieval and early modern world came the man who might be wine's single most obsessive evangelist. And unlike Lucullus, this one wasn't chasing prestige. He was chasing survival for an entire nation's reputation. Dom Perignon, the blind Benedictine monk at the Abbey of Hautevillers in the Champagne region of France, is often mythologized as the inventor of champagne, which isn't quite true. Sparkling wine likely predates him. But what is true and remarkable is that Perignon spent decades of his life obsessively trying to eliminate the very bubbles that would later make the region famous, considering them a defect, a spoilage, something to be engineered out of existence through relentless blending experiments across dozens of grape varieties and vineyard plots. He is said to have had an extraordinarily refined palate, allegedly able to identify the exact village a grape came from just by tasting it. And monks at the abbey told stories of him running toward the cellar, shouting to his brothers that he was drinking stars, the moment he finally accepted that the bubbles he'd fought for decades were not a flaw at all, but the future. Whether that exact phrase is legend or later invention hardly matters. What matters is that a blind monk spent his entire adult life obsessing over grape juice with the same fanatical devotion a general once spent on conquest, and in doing so, helped lay the foundation for one of the most valuable luxury products on earth. The eccentric ruler this story needs arrives a little later, and this one is not French but Russian, and slightly unhinged in the most literal sense. Peter the Great, determined to drag Russia into European sophistication by force if necessary, became fixated on wine and spirits as symbols of the modern empire he wanted to build. He staged banquets where courtiers were compelled to drink enormous ceremonial goblets of wine as punishment or initiation, sometimes forcing foreign ambassadors to match his own drinking pace under threat of insult to the crown. Reportedly, he even created a mock institution he called the all-joking, all-drunken synod, a grotesque parody of the church hierarchy he despised, complete with its own patriarch, whose central ritual involved forcing members to drink themselves into oblivion as a kind of state theater. It's absurd, it's a little disturbing, and it is entirely true that a Russian czar built part of his court culture around compulsory drunkenness as a tool of political humiliation and control. Wine and its stronger cousins became, quite literally, an instrument of statecraft. By the time European empires began reaching across oceans, wine had become fully entangled with colonial ambition. Spanish missionaries planted vineyards throughout the Americas, not for pleasure, but for the same reason Roman legions once needed it: sacrament and control. Communion wine required for religious conversion, vineyards springing up in Mexico, Peru, and eventually California, planted by mission labor that in many documented cases was coerced. Indigenous populations forced into agricultural work under a colonial hierarchy that dressed itself in religious language. The vines that would one day make Napa Valley world famous were, in their earliest incarnation, tools of empire disguised as sacraments, carried across an ocean to serve a ritual that had nothing to do with the people whose labor made it possible. This is the part worth sitting with for a moment longer. Nearly every major turn in wine's history, Roman, medieval, colonial, repeats the same quiet pattern. A drink treated as sacred or prestigious at the top of a society, and underneath it, almost always, someone with no choice in the matter doing the actual labor that made the prestige possible. The unnamed enslaved worker in a Sicilian vineyard, the coerced convert tending Spanish mission vines 3 continents away. The pattern doesn't announce itself in the history books the way kings and conquests do, but it's there in almost every century you look. And then, in the middle of the 19th century, wine nearly died altogether. Not through war, not through decree, but through an insect smaller than a grain of rice. Phylloxera, a microscopic aphid-like pest native to North America, arrived in France sometime in the 1860s, likely hitching a ride on American vine cuttings brought over by botanists curious about new grape varieties. The insect fed on the roots of European grapevines, and because those vines had no natural resistance, it spread through French vineyards like a plague, moving through a population with no immunity. Within roughly 2 decades, Phylloxera destroyed an estimated 2/3 to 9/10 of all vineyards in France. An agricultural catastrophe so severe that entire regions considered abandoning winemaking permanently. Think about that for a second. A species of louse, invisible to the naked eye, brought entire centuries of French winemaking tradition to the edge of extinction, and very nearly succeeded. The blight itself was nature, but the near total collapse it caused was compounded by years of French vintners refusing to believe American scientists who correctly diagnosed the cause and proposed the cure. That cure, when it finally came, was almost embarrassingly simple and deeply ironic. The very American vine rootstock that had unknowingly carried the pest into France turned out to be naturally resistant to it. French winemakers, swallowing considerable pride, began grafting their prized European vines onto American roots, a practice that continues, largely unchanged, in the overwhelming majority of vineyards on Earth today. Nearly every glass of French wine you have ever tasted, every Bordeaux, every Burgundy, grew from vines whose roots trace back not to French soil at all, but to the wild, unglamorous vineyards of the American Midwest and East Coast. That's a fact most sommeliers won't tell you at a dinner party, because it slightly deflates the romance. But it's true, and it's exactly the kind of detail that changes how you see a bottle of wine forever. Now, for the part that should make your head spin a little, because wine's strange modern life is stranger than most people realize. In 1985, an Austrian wine scandal broke when regulators discovered that some producers had been illegally adding diethylene glycol, a compound used in antifreeze, to sweeten cheap wine and pass it off as a more expensive late-harvest vintage, a fraud that collapsed the entire Austrian wine export industry almost overnight and took nearly a decade to rebuild trust. In 1985, a wine that later turned out to be one of the most expensive bottles ever sold, supposedly once owned by Thomas Jefferson himself, ignited a decades-long authenticity scandal after a billionaire collector bought it for over $150,000, only for later investigations to suggest it may have been an elaborate forgery, a reminder that even among the wealthiest collectors on Earth, wine remains an object people are willing to lie about, fake, and fight over. Wine has been carried to the International Space Station for controlled fermentation experiments, testing whether the absence of gravity changes the chemical structure of tannins. And reportedly, astronauts have found that wine aged in orbit develops different, sometimes harsher flavor compounds than the identical bottle aged on Earth, a discovery that is quietly reshaping how scientists think about flavor chemistry itself. And right now, in cellars beneath Champagne, France, there exist bottles deliberately left corked and untouched for over 200 years, some from vintages older than the country's current government, kept as living time capsules of a harvest nobody left alive today ever tasted fresh. Consider the sheer scale of what this small, fermented fruit juice has become. Global wine consumption today measures in the tens of billions of liters a year, an ocean of fermented grapes large enough that if you poured a single year's global production into a single reservoir, it would rival the volume of a mid-sized lake. Americans alone drink close to 1 billion gallons of wine annually, a figure that would have seemed like fiction to the Roman senators who once had women executed for touching the stuff. And still, underneath every one of those billion gallons is the same ancient chemical accident: yeast, sugar, and time, doing exactly what it did in a clay jar in the Caucasus 8,000 years ago, before anyone had a word for empire or for sin or for celebration. Think back for a moment to that cellar outside Pompeii, to those 18 people curled together in the dark beneath a mountain that had already decided their fate before the ash even began to fall. They died surrounded by the very product that had made their region prosperous, sealed the trade routes that fed their town, financed the villas above their heads. The wine could not save them. And in a strange, cruel way, it didn't need to. It had already done its job for centuries, building the empire whose ruins we still walk through today, glass in hand, tasting a drink whose history is stitched together with monks and monarchs, enslaved hands and blind saints, empires that rose on it and very nearly died protecting it. You have poured a glass of wine at a dinner, a wedding, a quiet Tuesday night, and never once thought about the Roman law that could have had a woman killed for doing exactly that, or the Phylloxera louse that once brought an entire nation's winemaking to its knees, or the American roots holding up half the vineyards of France. You will never look at a glass of wine the same way again. If this story stuck with you, tell us in the comments which detail hit hardest: the Roman law that made drinking wine a capital offense for women, the tiny insect that nearly wiped out French wine forever, or the Antifreeze scandal that brought down an entire country's export industry overnight. And if you want more stories like this, the ordinary objects hiding extraordinary, uncomfortable history, subscribe because we're just getting started.